Hello, hello. Today's video is in defense of Charlotte Lucas, who I think is one of the best characters from Pride and Prejudice. I love her so much, and I've heard all sorts of opinions about her. Most people are in positive, they like her, but they feel like she made a bad decision in marrying Mr. Collins, and that she is a test case in that sense of like what you shouldn't do. And I don't really agree with that. I think Charlotte is a very practical person who made a good decision for her. And so I want to talk about what I think about Charlotte Lucas and how you shouldn't rate her so lowly because Charlotte is amazing. And the picture I have of Charlotte here is, of course, Charlotte from the 1995 miniseries, which is my favorite version of Pride and Prejudice. So, got pictures of her for that. So, my first point is that Charlotte Lucas is a realist. She knows about her society, and she's in a very different place than Lizzie Bennet is, and that's, why she ends up making different decisions. She's a different person, but she's also in a different situation, and she's very realistic about the world she lives in, and she's never lied about that. Early on in the book, she says things to Lizzie that Lizzie does not agree with and thinks that she's joking. But I don't think she is. I think she is being very realistic. It says that in the book that she doesn't think highly of men or marriage, and yet she still plans to be married because that is the option that is available to her in the world that she is living in. So, at this time period, it's not like she had a lot of other options, and she's very realistic about what she's expecting from this marriage. My hot take on Charlotte is something that I haven't really heard a lot of other people talk about, but I think is realistic. And so a lot of people I've heard commentary on from people talking about Pride and Prejudice seem to put Charlotte as a lesbian, which I don't hate that reading, but that is not my reading and not my version of it. I really see Charlotte as ace, or asexual, aromantic. She literally in the book says, "I'm not romantic, you know." Um, she doesn't think highly of men or of marriage. She says she's not romantic. She doesn't really seem to care about the marriage relationship in and of itself, which I think is telling about Charlotte, right? She's not here for the marriage. She is not longing necessarily for a romantic relationship. I see her as somebody who's not particularly interested in that, and in a modern time would just be single and be fine with that. But because of the time period she lives in and the realistic expectations she has of her own life, she knows that's not an option. So she is going to be going into a marriage for the monetary reasons because those are the only reasons that matter to her. And I think that's a very fair thing to say. So she is in a time period where a single woman who of her class really doesn't have a lot of job opportunities, right? She of her class and station and what would be seen as appropriate in society, which Charlotte is very appropriate. She's not bucking the system. She's not that kind of person. Would be a governess or companion to a rich family. And both of those things would have been seen socially as a degradation, as a lowering of herself to go work. So they're not seen as great options that people want to go into. It is the way to not starve, but it's not seen as a good thing that you have to do this, to go into service like that. So she doesn't have really good options. She would probably stay living with her family. So she's in a better situation than the Bennets in that she has brothers who will inherit the money and who would be seen as required again by society to take care of her. She sh would probably be able to live at Lucas Lodge for the rest of her life and be cared for by, or paid for, I suppose, by her siblings, but she would be seen as a dependent on for her brother and, taking resources from her brother. So that is also not a great option. And so I really do think that this is a job opportunity for Charlotte Lucas. It is not a marriage in the traditional sense with Mr. Collins. And we see that when Elizabeth goes to visit her. at Hunsford in Kent that, she has really made her house her home. She seems happy with her house and having her own privacy and having her own life in that sense. And that's a good thing for her. And that's what I mean. She made a decision for her. And a lot of people who have more romantic feelings might never be able to understand how she could do it. But with my reading of her as Ace, I think that that's part of why this decision made so much sense for her. She's not looking for a good romantic relationship, and Mr. Collins is meh. Doesn't really matter if that's not what's important to you. So, the realities of Charlotte's situation. She's not really a legal entity in a lot of ways. She has no real chance of making her own living, except for as a governess as a companion, and both would have been seen as bad, right? She wouldn't have made a lot of money. There was no retirement plan from either option. You just have to hope that the families you work for are good to you. Her family would have been expected to take care of her, like I said, her brothers, but she would have been seen as a dependent and drain on her family. And she was already being looked down upon. You can see that from things like Mrs. Bennet would say about Charlotte. She was being looked down upon for being a spinster. She was already facing no negative social consequences for not marrying, and she would be well aware of that. And the other thing I want to talk about is her home life prior to marriage is also very different than Elizabeth's. Something I haven't heard really people talk about is that I feel that Mr. Collins and Sir Lucas are very similar people. They have very similar personality quirks. They would make good friends. They hang out together and they talk together and they seem to like each other. They have very similar thoughts on things. So she's already living with Sir Lucas as her father, um, who is a very similar person to Mr. Collins. So I don't know that her home life is being materially worse in having to spend time with Mr. Collins versus Sir Lucas in that sense. Now, we're not talking about marriage bed. Obviously, that's not what she's doing with her father, but living in the house with him, I don't think would be less pleasant necessarily to live with Mr. Collins than Sir Lucas in a lot of ways. Now, Mr. Collins does seem a little bit mm, more supercilious, I suppose, than Sir Lucas. So I do think Mr. Collins is a little bit worse, but I think it's gray. It's not a clear distinction of like living with Sir Lucas would be so happy and wonderful, and Mr. Collins is completely different. I think that they're very similar people. And I do think that Mr. Collins is a little slimier, and I would pick Sir Lucas over Mr. Collins. But I do think that they're very similar people, and that's something to think about because saying no to Mr. Collins, so not marrying Mr. Collins, means that she has to continue living with Sir Lucas and his wife and his other children, who are in many ways similar to Mr. Collins in that sense. So maybe that is part of this consideration that Charlotte has that honestly her life is not changing that much in having to deal with Mr. Collins when she's already had to deal with Sir Lucas her whole life and has probably already figured out how to manage Sir Lucas, and a lot of those same things are going to work to manage Mr. Collins. Um, I would also like to point out that Lady Lucas is besties with Mrs. Bennet. So we don't see Lady Lucas all that much, but do know she's good friends with Mrs. Bennet, and she is not too smart to be a good companion to Mrs. Bennet. I think it's not worded exactly like that, but our description of Lady Lucas is that she is a good companion and on a similar level intellectually to Mrs. Bennet. So having to deal with her parents, honestly, for somebody like Charlotte is probably a bit of a trial. If we're dealing with someone who is very similar to Mrs. Bennet and then someone who is very similar to Mr. Collins as her parents who are in charge of her and her guardians over her and in control of her in that sense. So going from having to deal with both of them to only having to deal with one, so Mr. Collins as her like the person in charge of her, but also feeling like as a wife having more say in having a slightly more equal relationship with Mr. Collins than she could have with her parents. Um, Now obviously in this time period the husband is legally in control of her. She doesn't have any legal power where she's unequal to him, but I do think that Charlotte is clearly the intellectually superior person, and she can walk circles around Mr. Collins. I think she can manage and control him very easily. And as a wife, she would be in a better situation to do that, to really manage the situation than she would with her parents. So I do think that it's more of a lateral move than a downgrade, the way I think a lot of people see it, because you really do have to think about who her parents are and what her home life is like. The other thing I would point out about her current home life before she moves, before she gets married, is that we don't see a lot of her re actually interacting with her siblings, but we do know there's a bunch of them. And it's definitely mentioned when she gets married that her younger siblings are all very happy that she's getting married. Her brothers were worried about having to take care of her. Her sisters get to come out earlier than they thought they might into society. And so that's another piece of the pressure on her, right? That we're thinking about. So if her brothers are already making comments to her about not wanting to have to take care of her when they're older, that's a piece of the puzzle, right? That she is taking into account in her decision, that she's already got brothers who are probably telling her that they don't want to have to take care of her or making little derogatory comments or little backhanded things about how they're not looking forward to having to take care of Charlotte forever. Um, so being able to kind of get out of that situation is an important piece. And that's my one of my big points of this is I don't think Charlotte has a happy home life. And that's a very different situation to even Elizabeth, who her home life isn't perfect, but honestly, I think she's relatively happy. Her mom annoys her and embarrasses her sometimes, but for the most part, she loves her sisters. Yes, some of her sisters annoy her and sometimes too, but that's pretty normal. Like it's nothing crazy. Loves her dad. She has a best friend in Jane. Like I think she's relatively happy. If her life continued the way it was at Longbourn, she'd be fine. Whereas I don't know that we can say that that's true for Charlotte. I really do think that based on what we have from her, I think that there's a relatively good case to make that she might not have been quite so happy at home. And so the cost benefit is therefore a little different. That she is leaving a relatively unhappy home life to another home life where at least she has more peace. So she doesn't have a million siblings putting pressure on her, making comments at her. Um, and her family's all going to be happy about this. And her trade-off is that she has to go live with Mr. Collins, which is definitely a trade-off. But if his personality is very similar to what she's already used to, it's not a downgrade. It's again a lateral move. And so the only piece that I think is really problematic would then be, of course, the fact that going to be expected to sleep with Mr. Collins, as his wife. But again, I think she can manage that, and she doesn't really know what that means from a woman from her situation. So I wonder if she's even really taking that into consideration all that much. She might want kids. So that might be something that she's willingly thinking about wanting to do anyway. I don't think she's attracted to Mr. Collins, but again, going back to I think that she's ace, I think that she kind of sees him as no worse than anybody else. So if you're not attracted to anybody and you're not particularly interested in a romantic or sexual relationship anyway, then somebody like Mr. Collins, who honestly doesn't want that either, like he doesn't care whether he's in love, he's pretending. But it's very clear that he doesn't really know what that means and doesn't even know Charlotte and doesn't care. She's going to be able to have her own life and do what she wants to do pretty successfully, I think, without really any worries about it in that sense. Like she has made a decision that is, again, correct for her and her situation. And I really want to defend Charlotte as I think she made the right choice for her. I think that Lizzie Bennet would have been miserable if she married Mr. Collins. I think Lizzie Bennet was also correct. But Charlotte's in a very situation, has a different home life, has different wants and needs. There's no reason to think that Charlotte has been longing for and looking for a romantic relationship. Just because the majority of people want that doesn't mean everybody does. Asexual people exist, aromantic people exist. And my reading of Charlotte, I really love her as ace representation. So that is my hot take on Charlotte is that I think that she is ace in a society that does not accept that is an option for anyone. But on the other hand, doesn't really think that ladies should have sexual interests anyway. So I think she can kind of get away with it. Um, And I think that she made a decision that makes a lot of sense for her to get the home, like house and independence that she wants for the price of having to spend some time with Mr. Collins, but really not all that much because he spends most of the day other places and she's very good at making sure that she gets her own private time, which I think that she must have loved. I'm just thinking of being in a house full of people constantly as an introvert. The idea of going from that house of, I'm thinking 10 kids. I have no idea how many Lucas children are running around, but a lot of them is the general consensus. There's a number of children of various ages running around all the time that Charlotte, as I think the oldest daughter, is probably having to play second mom to. Um, Going from a house of chaos like that to a house with just her and Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins she can send out to the garden all day. I think I'd make that choice too. And I really do think that Charlotte had good reason to do what she did, and I will defend Charlotte to the end of the earth. I love her. She's the best. I think she made the correct decision, and I think you should stop feeling sorry for her and doing all that pitying, like, oh, poor Charlotte, the way that Lizzie does. I think Lizzie is very judgmental in this situation and doesn't see the forest for the trees just because Lizzie was correct that she would be miserable in that situation and she doesn't want to live that way. I agree with her. Lizzie should not have said yes. Lizzie should not have taken this. But Charlotte's a different person coming from a different situation and in a different place. And I think Charlotte, while not being overjoyed about having to marry Mr. Collins, and I think in a perfect world would have remained single and could have been a nice ace person who had a job in the real world now, at the time, I made the best decision possible from her realistic options and her realistic, like view of her own society. And I think she'll be happy and content in her life. I think she'll be fine. Um, and I love her, and I think she made the right choice, and I would like to defend it. So feel free to let me know if you think that I have completely lost my mind on this and I'm completely wrong, or if you agree with me. Let me know you think of my hot take on Charlotte as an ace character, as ace representation in my favorite book ever. Do you agree with my reading? Do you not? What do you think?